A young woman saved the prince from death, then mysteriously vanished at dawn. The midsummer air shimmered with heat and the sweet tang of crushed grass beneath countless feet. At the edge of Greystone Manor's lawn, where the gravel path turned to packed earth, Annalore Reed stood with her hands folded lightly before her. Her gown, though plain, a faded forest green wool with carefully mended seams, had been freshly pressed. Her dark chestnut hair was coiled into a modest knot at her nape, the edges softened by the rising humidity. No jewels adorned her throat, no powder dusted her skin. Yet she carried herself with a kind of quiet composure that set her apart. The gathering was already in full swing. Servants bustled in discreet lines, carrying silver trays of elderflower cordial and sugared biscuits to tables flanked by the gentry. The shrill laughter of noblewomen trilled over the deeper hum of political talk among the men. A quartet played a lively reel beneath a white canopy, though few dared dance so early in the afternoon. Annalore remained near the edges, neither welcomed nor removed. Her presence, as always, straddled an uneasy middle. She had been invited, if one could call it that, by virtue of her work with Master Hewitt, the village apothecary whose tinctures and remedies served both tenant farmers and manor residents. Her usefulness granted her a kind of liminal existence. She was familiar, but not one of them. Still, she could feel their eyes. She turned her head slightly and caught the glance of a young squire, bright-cheeked with an untamed laugh, speaking to a lady in a silk gown the color of gooseberries. He gestured subtly in Annalore's direction. A moment later, he said something that made the lady's lips curve in a smile too precise to be genuine. And then, as if drawn by the scent of threat, Lady Calthorne emerged. The mistress of Greystone Manor was an imposing figure, swathed in black silk trimmed with garnet ribbon, her silver blonde hair sculpted into a powdered tower that added another full inch to her already tall frame. She moved with deliberate grace, the click of her heeled shoes rhythmic on the stone path. Annalore lowered her gaze in polite greeting, then turned slightly to move away. "Miss Reed," Lady Calthorne's voice, low and cultured, cut across the lawn. "How charming to see you once again." Several nearby guests turned to look. Annalore paused, slowly pivoting back toward the older woman. "My lady," she said with quiet respect, offering a slight curtsy. "I was just remarking," Lady Calthorne said, folding her gloved hands, "on how striking the resemblance is. Isn't that so, Mr. Hensley?" The squire, caught mid-drink, coughed lightly and nodded, uncertain. Yes, Lady Calthorne. I merely noted that Miss Reed favors one of the portraits in the east corridor. A young lady who was once a maid in this house," Lady Calthorne interrupted smoothly. "Dismissed in unfortunate circumstances." The air seemed to thin. The musicians faltered in their tempo. Annalore felt her chest tighten. She didn't speak. Lady Calthorne turned slightly to face the small crowd that had begun to gather, her voice carrying with effortless authority. "It's strange, is it not, that history should repeat itself in such familiar lines? Of course, such likenesses are rarely coincidence. Blood will have its say, even when born out of wedlock." There it was, delivered with the cold precision of a knife across silk. Annalore stood motionless, the color draining from her face. Her breathing was shallow, but she would not let it break. The silence around her deepened. Even the birds in the hedgerow seemed to quiet. She felt the weight of 100 stares pressing against her skin, some curious, some smug. A few turned away, suddenly interested in the ground. She didn't glance toward Master Hewitt, though she knew exactly where he stood, near the refreshment table, his expression tight with calculation. He had raised her after her mother's death, brought her into his shop, taught her the healing arts. But he was already backing away. When Lady Calthorne caught his gaze, he gave a stiff nod and turned his back. The dismissal was complete. No words had been spoken directly against her, but the meaning was clear. She was the daughter of a disgraced servant, a product of shameful origins, and her presence was now no longer useful, but uncomfortable. The court of opinion had ruled. Annalore did not cry. She stood there until her vision steadied, until the flush in her throat cooled. And then she turned and walked. Not quickly, not with the desperation they might have expected, but with a careful, composed grace across the courtyard, down the slope toward the orchards, and into the woods that bordered the estate. The sky had shifted. Clouds rolled in from the west, dark and low. The warmth of midsummer had turned clammy, wind raking through the trees like fingers seeking purchase. She moved deeper into the woodlands, past the moss-covered stones, past the gnarled roots where she used to play as a child, her footsteps quickening only when she was certain no one could see. Branches snagged her sleeves, brambles clutched at her skirts. The tears came only after the manor was long behind her. She paused near a narrow brook, knelt, and cupped water to her face. Her reflection, blurred by ripples, looked unfamiliar, cheeks too pale, lips pressed too hard together. Her hands trembled, and she didn't know if it was from the cold or from the sudden wrenching emptiness in her chest. There was no home to return to now. Master Hewitt would not welcome her back. Without his sponsorship, there would be no way to earn a living, no protection from suspicion. In a village bound by patronage, she had no patron. The sky rumbled. Thunder cracked somewhere beyond the hills. Fat drops of rain began to fall, slow and deliberate at first, then in earnest. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and continued on, no longer caring about direction. She didn't know how long she walked. Time felt suspended, dissolved in the cold breath of the storm. It was only when her foot caught on something beneath the bracken that she stumbled. She looked down, blinking against the rain. There, half buried in mud and fern, was a boot, attached to a leg, a body. Her breath caught. He was lying awkwardly, as though dropped mid-motion. His coat was dark, soaked through with rain, but not torn in a way that suggested a fall. His hair was damp, sticking to his forehead. Blood trickled from a gash at his temple, mixing with water in the hollow of his throat. She knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse, weak but steady. Her mind raced. She looked around. The path behind her was barely a path at all now, swallowed by trees and mist. No time to think. No time to hesitate. She gripped him under the arms, ignoring the searing ache in her shoulders, and dragged him, inch by inch, toward the nearest place she could remember. The old shepherd's shelter lay just beyond the western ridge, a crumbling stone hut with no door and half a roof, abandoned years ago. She half carried, half pulled him over roots and moss, murmuring encouragement he could not hear. By the time they reached it, her muscles burned, her clothes clung to her skin, and the rain had turned the forest floor to sludge. Inside, it smelled of wet stone and rotting straw, but it was shelter. She eased him down onto a pile of old sheepskins, checked his wounds, and tore a strip from her own shift to bind the bleeding. Her hands were steady. She didn't let herself think about who he was, or what had happened, or why her heart beat so fiercely against her ribs. Only when she unfastened his soaked outer cloak to inspect for other injuries did she see it. Embroidered inside the lining, half hidden beneath the fold of wool, was a sigil stitched in crimson and gold, a crowned lion rampant, clutching a sword. Avildon. Her breath stopped. He was no ordinary man. He was the prince. And from the trees outside, the sound of horses, several, broke through the rain. Rain poured in silver curtains through the hole in the roof, drumming against the sagging timbers above. The shepherd's shelter was nothing more than a crumbling pile of stone and shadow, but Annalore had managed to clear the worst of the old straw and lay the prince, on a patch of burlap she found bundled in one corner. The moment she'd seen the sigil stitched into his cloak, her heart had leapt into her throat. Prince Edward of Avildon, the second son, heir presumptive to the throne since the king's line had thinned, a royal man, lying senseless in her arms like any other. She moved quickly and without hesitation, burying her panic beneath the cold clarity of habit. Years of tending wounds, of calming fevered children and staunching the bleeding of farmers crushed beneath oxen, had taught her that fear had no place in a healer's hands. She lit the small lantern she kept in her satchel, its flame muted by the storm. Shielding it beneath her shawl to keep it from casting light through the cracks, she placed it beside him and began her work. Blood had matted his golden hair to his scalp. She used a strip of linen to gently clean the gash at his temple, dabbing it with diluted comfrey and yarrow tinctures she'd preserved in glass-stoppered vials. His skin was clammy, his pulse erratic. She tugged open his cloak and jerkin, wincing at the blood-stained shirt beneath. His side was swollen, likely bruised or cracked ribs, but the wound in his shoulder needed more attention. She rinsed it with water from her flask, ground dried chamomile and marigold between her fingers, and pressed the mixture into the cut. He stirred, his mouth twitching as a groan broke past his lips. They shouldn't have... His voice cracked, raspy with pain. Orders, not mine. She leaned closer, pressing a cool cloth to his brow. His words came in pieces, fragments of thoughts trailing off into sleep. Betrayal, wrong orders, something about riders. But the only danger tonight came from the storm, which now raged beyond the broken doorway in gusts and howls. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak her name. Instead, she sat at his side and worked, her hands steady, her heart a storm of its own. When thunder cracked above them, he started awake, reaching for something unseen. She grasped his hand instinctively, anchoring him with her touch. It was warm and calloused, startling in its strength. "Rest," she murmured. "You're safe." He stilled. The hours passed slowly. Rain tapped like fingers against the stone walls. She checked his bandages twice, added feverfew to his temples, and slipped her own cloak over him to keep the chill from creeping in. She kept the shawl over the lantern, letting only a dim glow fall over them. It felt as if the storm had trapped them outside of time, wrapped the shelter in its own breath, and left the rest of the world far behind. He woke again near midnight, more lucid this time, his green eyes unfocused but searching. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, but beneath it was a strength that reminded her of who he was. "In the hills, west of Greystone," she answered quietly, squeezing water from a cloth before pressing it to his lips. "You were hurt. I found you." He drank, and his eyes didn't leave hers. "You saved me." She didn't respond. A flicker of expression crossed his face. Confusion, pain, then something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. His gaze dropped to the flask in her hand, then back to her face. "Your hands," he whispered. "They don't tremble. They can't afford to," she said. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh, but it broke on the edges of pain. She helped him lie back, adjusting the folds of her cloak to keep him warm. "You're not," he started, but winced before finishing. She didn't ask what he meant. The answer didn't matter. For tonight, he was a man and she was a healer, and that was all the world could bear. Sometime near dawn, his breathing steadied. The fever that had begun to creep over his skin receded beneath the weight of her remedies. Pale light began to filter through the cracks in the walls. She stood and crossed to the ruined doorway, scanning the misted woods for signs of pursuit. The storm had eased to a fine drizzle. The sky beyond the ridge was softening from pewter to silver. When she turned back, he was sitting upright, his back braced against the stones. "You shouldn't move yet," she said, crossing to kneel beside him. His eyes met hers fully this time, clearer, sharper. He was no longer the broken man she'd pulled through the bracken. He was returning to himself piece by piece. "I know who you are," he said softly. "You knew me first." Annalore didn't answer. His gaze traveled over her face, resting briefly on her mouth, then back to her eyes. "You saved me. And yet, you won't tell me your name?" She rose, brushing off her skirt. "No." "Why?" Because it isn't one you should remember. He tilted his head slightly, a muscle twitching at his jaw. You're wrong about that. Annalore turned away and reached for her satchel. The moment the sun cleared the ridge, riders might return. Whoever had left him wounded in the forest would not be far behind for long. And she couldn't be found here. Not with him. She wrapped a strip of linen and folded it into a square. Crossing back to him, she pressed it into his hand. For your wound. The tincture will hold for a few days. Rest until then. He looked down at the cloth, then back up, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze. She hesitated only a second more. Then she stepped toward the doorway, her shoes silent on the damp floor. The scent of lavender lingered as she slipped through the trees. It was nearly midday when a patrol from the Royal Road found Prince Edward, weakened but alive. They recognized him immediately, bundled him into a carriage, and rushed him back to the palace with the kind of alarmed reverence reserved only for those whose blood could never be spilled without consequence. His wounds were tended by royal physicians, his rest guarded by sentries. But though his body healed, his mind remained unsettled. He gave no report of the hours between the ambush and his rescue. When asked who had helped him, he said only that he remembered little. No one questioned him, not openly. He had been attacked, perhaps by highwaymen, though some whispered darker things. His brother, the king, demanded he stay within palace walls until further notice. He agreed outwardly, nodded through meetings, and returned to his quarters with uncharacteristic silence. But sleep did not come easily. He remembered her hands first, then her voice, her refusal to be known. He remembered the way she had watched him with careful eyes, the tremble of her fingers that never came, the feeling of being tended not as a prince, but as a man. The memory of her face hovered between clarity and dream. One morning, just past the third day of his recovery, Edward woke before dawn and dressed not in his court attire, but in the plainest clothes he owned. A brown coat, leather boots, a shirt without lace or embroidery. He fastened a small satchel of coin to his belt and took only what he needed. A stable boy let him ride out under the assumption he was inspecting the grounds. He passed through the palace gates unnoticed. By the time the king's household awoke, Edward was already a day's journey north. He traveled without attendants, keeping to the old trade roads and the shelter of wayfarers' inns. In his silence and modest dress, he passed for a minor merchant or a scholar, a man of no particular consequence. His thoughts were fixed not on his name or station, but on a patch of wild hills near Greystone, and a woman who had walked away from him before he could ask her to stay. He reached the edge of the village under cover of morning mist. The sky hung low, the air sharp with the scent of peat smoke and damp earth. He dismounted near the edge of the commons and walked toward the well at the center of the village green, his heart drumming with a quiet, relentless rhythm. She was there. Her hair was loose, curling with the morning damp. Her eyes shadowed beneath a sleepless brow. She bent to draw water, unaware that someone was watching her. Then slowly, she lifted her gaze and saw him. The village of Greystone stirred slowly in the mornings, wrapped in the blue hush of mist and the scent of damp loam rising from the earth. Edward stood just outside the apothecary shed behind Master Hewitt's former cottage, the air cool against his skin, sleeves rolled up to the elbows as he reached into a bed of wild feverfew. Across the narrow garden, Annalore moved with silent purpose, a woven basket hanging from one arm. She hadn't spoken more than necessary since the morning at the well, when their eyes had locked and memory had crashed between them like a wave. She hadn't asked who he truly was, nor had she demanded answers about why he had come back. If she'd been surprised to see him again, she gave no sign of it, but she hadn't turned him away either. When he'd asked, quietly, cautiously, for instruction in herbal work, claiming an interest born from convalescence, she'd studied him for a long moment before nodding once. He had given a false name, Thomas Vale, and she hadn't questioned it. But something in her gaze had made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. Still, she allowed him to follow her into the woods, to kneel beside her as she gathered angelica and dock leaf. She let him lift the kettle off the hearth, handed him sprigs of mint to crush, and wordlessly passed him a vial when he forgot where she'd placed it. Small things, quiet permissions, as though testing the weight of his sincerity with every hour he remained. They worked late into the afternoons, sometimes into the night. By the second evening, he was standing beside her as she poured beeswax into salve jars, his hand brushing hers when he steadied a cooling bowl. He didn't speak of the night in the shelter, and neither did she. The memory hung between them, unspoken, thrumming, persistent. One evening, he leaned too close to inspect the edge of a burning poultice, and she turned her face just as he did. For a breathless moment their cheeks brushed, the soft warmth of her skin grazing his. She pulled back first, though not abruptly. Her eyes held his for a beat longer than necessary before she reached for another cloth, saying nothing. The work continued. Their rhythm deepened with the days. In the hush of candlelight, in the murmur of pestle and mortar, their silences grew charged. She moved, as if every step was weighed against discretion, as though knowing too much would break something they hadn't named. And yet, she allowed him to stay. He didn't ask why. He only watched. Annalore often avoided the center of the village, preferring to trade remedies by leaving parcels at the doorsteps of those she helped. But on the 6th morning, she ventured toward the main lane, leaving Edward to label a shelf of jars in her absence. The fire crackled gently behind him, and he adjusted the writing on each scrap of parchment with quiet focus. He didn't hear the approaching footsteps until the door opened. She wore black again, not morning black, but ceremonial, dignified, expensive, precise. Lady Calthorne stepped into the cottage as if she owned it, her pale eyes sweeping the room like a hawk surveying a field. She was alone, though her presence filled the space with a cool and pointed disapproval. "You are the man they call Mr. Vale," she said, not as a question, but a statement already stripped of patience. Edward turned, masking his expression. "I am. May I help you?" "You might," she said, walking deeper into the cottage. Her gloved fingers drifted across the rim of a jar. "Though I rather think that depends on your answer to a few delicate inquiries." He didn't respond. Lady Calthorne tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "You are not from here, and yet you've made yourself very comfortable under Miss Reed's roof." The pause lingered. "She is not in need of scandal, you understand. Her situation is precarious enough, and though Greystone is small, it is not without standards." Edward said nothing, but the line of his shoulders tensed. She smiled thinly. "I made some inquiries," she continued. "No parish record of your birth, no family in Cumberland or Yorkshire, and your manner, Mr. Vale, is not quite the manner of a tradesman's son." Edward met her gaze squarely. "Perhaps not, but I don't believe Miss Reed requires your protection." "No?" Lady Calthorne moved to stand directly before him. "Then allow me to offer you something else, a solution." She leaned forward slightly. "I am prepared to see to your return to court, quietly and with discretion. I'll make the necessary arrangements for travel. In exchange, you will remove yourself from Greystone without delay. If you're worried about reputation, there will be no whispers, no consequences. And for your cooperation, you'll be favorably placed. I know several young women of good family who would be pleased to meet a man of adaptable background." He didn't answer. Her smile sharpened. "Miss Reed is of no consequence, Mr. Vale. Whatever you imagine this may be, it cannot be sustained. She will never be welcomed into society, much less a world as delicate as yours. Your attachment, however touching, would ruin her more than you realize." Edward stared at her in silence. His hands had clenched at his sides. Lady Calthorne turned away without waiting for his answer. "I'll expect to hear of your departure by week's end," she said over her shoulder. "Preferably sooner." She left the cottage with the soft click of her heels, the scent of rose oil trailing behind her. Neither of them had noticed the half-ajar window near the back wall. nor the slender shadow just beyond it, standing still in the garden's overgrown edge. Annalore didn't wait to hear more. She stepped away from the window, the breeze tugging at her shawl. Her breath came too fast. Her stomach knotted with something sharp and heavy. She had only gone to the baker's stall, only meant to return before the tea finished steeping. She hadn't expected to find Lady Calthorne at her door, and she hadn't meant to overhear. But she had. She'd heard the words. Of course she had. She had been standing there long enough. Remove yourself from Greystone. Favorable marriage. No place for her. She didn't need to hear Edward's answer. His silence had said enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She returned to the cottage after Lady Calthorne's departure, face composed, and found Edward standing at the counter, his jaw tight. He turned when she entered, but she said nothing. She only crossed to the stove, stirred the tea, and asked if he needed more willow bark pressed. They worked side by side as they had every day, but the rhythm had changed. Something had shifted, cracked. When the candles burned low and the hearth turned to embers, she wished him a quiet good night and retreated to the small room off the rear of the cottage. He watched her go, not knowing that she would not return. Hours later, long after the village had gone still and the moon cast thin light over the fields, Annalore packed a basket with quiet hands. She took only what she needed: a change of clothes, a pouch of coin, a folded note she had once tucked away in case of flight. She paused at the door, staring at the room she had made her own, the shelves filled with her work, the walls lined with dried herbs and pale linen. Then she turned, crossed to the front room, and placed a single sprig of half-dried lavender on the sill. The air was cool and still when Edward awoke, the scent of tea still faint in the corners. He crossed to her room and knocked, once, twice. No answer. He opened the door. The bed was empty. He walked back to the hearth. The fire had gone out. Her baskets were gone, and on the windowsill, just beside the morning light, lay the lavender, fragile, wilted, and final. The bells from the chapel tower rang low and sweet across the valley, signaling the start of Greystone's harvest festival. The square was already alive with color and movement, ribbons tied to tree branches, wreaths of dried wheat above every door, the scent of roasted apples and cinnamon thick in the air. Long trestle tables lined the main lane, draped in linen, their surfaces crowded with pies, jugs of cider, and baskets brimming with late autumn squash. Children darted between the adults, trailing laughter and crumbs. It was the last celebration before winter would close its fist around the land, and the village had turned out in full. At the edge of the crowd, Annalore stood half-shielded by the curve of a cottage wall, her cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her hood was up, though she knew it was little disguise. Several villagers had already looked her way with wary expressions, half curiosity, half unease. She had returned only the day before, slipping back into Greystone after a week of silence and solitude. She hadn't sent word. She hadn't dared. The cottage she'd once called her own had not been touched. A fine layer of dust lay over the hearth and table. The lavender she had left behind had withered into brittle stalks. She had returned because of the festival, because it was tradition, and because she had always loved the way the village glowed with warmth at harvest's end. But also because something in her could no longer bear to stay away. Not when the days had turned too quiet. Not when his absence felt too heavy. She hadn't seen Edward since the night she left. Now, surrounded by laughter and music, she stood still and apart, watching the rhythms of life she had once belonged to. Her hands were cold. The knot in her chest wouldn't loosen. At the far end of the green, a small stage had been erected, no more than a raised wooden platform for the mayor and landowners to offer their annual blessings and speeches. Lady Calthorne stood near its center, speaking softly to the mayor. Her black gown gleamed in the morning light, her posture regal and fixed. She had not seen Annalore, not yet, but she did not remain unaware for long. As the speeches began and the crowd gathered more tightly, Lady Calthorne's gaze swept the audience. When it landed on Annalore, she paused. Her smile did not falter, but her eyes sharpened. She took the stage. "My dear villagers," she began, her voice smooth and well-practiced, carrying effortlessly above the crowd. "It brings me joy to see such devotion to our customs. The harvest is a time of gratitude, of honoring the labors that feed us, clothe us, warm our homes. And it is a time of cleansing, the land of rot, and the village of what might corrupt it." Annalore's breath caught. Lady Calthorne stepped forward. "Which is why, before we dance and feast, it is my duty to speak plainly, on a matter of concern to us all." A hush fell. The air shifted. Somewhere behind Annalore, a child let go of a ball of yarn that bounced away unnoticed. "I refer," Lady Calthorne continued, "to the presence of one Annalore Reed, a young woman of uncertain origin, who has, until recently, made herself a fixture in this village, under the protection of those who perhaps did not see fit to question her lineage or her intent." Murmurs rose, tentative at first. Lady Calthorne's voice grew harder. "She is no longer under such protection, and in her absence, troubling revelations have come to light. Rumors of her involvement in matters that are not only improper, but dangerous. It is said she uses her herbs not only for healing, but to manipulate, to seduce." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some frowned, others whispered. Annalore stood frozen. "Indeed," Lady Calthorne said, letting the silence stretch. "There are whispers of her having ensnared a man of noble blood, hiding him, treating him in secret, perhaps in hopes of binding him to her through unnatural means." Someone gasped. "She would have you believe she is harmless. But deception often wears the plainest face. She did not act alone, nor innocently. There is talk of influence, of potions, of enchantment. I need not say the word aloud. You all understand what I imply." Annalore's hands clenched at her sides. "Such dangers cannot be permitted in a place like Greystone," Lady Calthorne concluded, voice rising with practiced authority. "I call for her to be removed, for the safety of this village and the purity of our traditions." The crowd wavered. Some looked to each other, uncertain. A few took a cautious step back, as if unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Annalore felt the pull of their confusion, some suspicious, others frightened, most unwilling to choose a side. Lady Calthorne opened her mouth again to seal the moment, but another voice cut through the gathering like a blade. "Enough!" It was not shouted, it was not theatrical, but it rang with such clarity and command that every head turned. A man stood at the base of the platform, coat damp from travel, boots dusted with the road. He removed his tricorn hat slowly, the wind catching at the ends of his hair. When he raised his face to the crowd, there was no hiding who he was. Gasps rippled outward. Prince Edward. Lady Calthorne went rigid. He climbed the steps of the platform without haste. When he turned to face the crowd, his gaze was steady, his voice calm and unmistakably royal. "There will be no exile," he said. "There will be no accusations made without truth." He looked down at Lady Calthorne. "And there will be no more slander spoken about a woman who risked everything to save my life." The villagers stood in stunned silence. Edward turned to them. "You know me now, but you do not know what she did. When I was wounded and hunted, it was Annalore Reed who found me. She could have turned away. She could have taken her safety and left me to die. Instead, she carried me, bleeding, fevered, half mad, to shelter. She bound my wounds, stayed with me through the night, and never once asked who I was or what she might gain." The crowd was still. "She asked for nothing, not favor, not protection, not even a name." His voice softened. "She is the reason I stand before you today, and I have not forgotten her strength, her dignity, or the way she walked away from me before I could even thank her." His gaze swept the crowd again. "I have returned not as a prince in search of allegiance. I have returned because I could not forget her, because I would not let silence steal what I should have spoken long ago. He turned toward where she stood at the edge of the crowd. "Annalore Reed," he said, "you are not beneath me. You are not unworthy. You are the most courageous person I have ever known, and I would rather stand beside you, despised by society, than return to a life without your presence in it." The silence held. Then, one by one, the villagers began to shift, turning toward her. She stood still, eyes wide, lips parted. Her breath trembled in her chest. Edward stepped down from the platform and extended his hand. The world narrowed. She could feel every heartbeat in her ribs, every pair of eyes watching. His hand was open, waiting. She did not move right away, but then she did. She stepped forward. The crowd parted. She walked until she reached him. She did not take his hand, not yet. She looked into his face and saw nothing hidden, no pretense. Only the same gentleness she remembered from the stormy night in the shepherd's hut. She placed her hand in his. He curled his fingers around hers with quiet certainty. "We will leave Greystone," he said, his voice low but sure. "Together." Her answer was the way she nodded once, not with hesitation, but with finality. Behind them, the square remained suspended in stillness. And as they turned toward the road ahead, the clouds overhead began to darken. The Palace of Avildon rose pale and sharp against the late autumn sky, its marble towers untouched by the soot of the city below. The royal court gathered in the Hall of Chambers that morning, in a hush of anticipation, murmurs passing between noblemen in powdered wigs and silk cuffs, their whispers winding through corridors like smoke. News of Prince Edward's arrival, accompanied by a woman of unknown name and unacknowledged blood, had already seeded scandal among the court. Annalore stood beneath the high arched windows, her hand wrapped tightly in Edward's. She wore no jewels, no brocade, only a simple gown of dove-grey wool and a traveling cloak fastened at the throat. Her hair had been pinned up with care but lacked the powdered curls and ribbons of courtly fashion. Her expression, however, was steady. She had known this moment would come, and she had not come to beg. The king sat at the end of the chamber in a high-backed carved chair, its dark wood gleaming. He was not a cruel man, nor quick-tempered, but his gaze carried the weight of a crown grown heavy with time. His silvered hair was tied back with a black ribbon, his ceremonial sash draped over his coat of state. As his eyes landed on Annalore, something passed across his face: curiosity, wariness, disappointment. Edward bowed, but not deeply. "My lord," he said, his voice even, "I have come to speak plainly." The king's brow lifted a fraction. "So I gather. I will not marry by arrangement. I will not bind myself to bloodlines that serve the throne, but mean nothing to me. I have found the woman I choose to stand beside, and I will not give her up to satisfy protocol." "Then you forget yourself," the king said, his voice cold but calm. "You speak as if your life is only yours. You were not raised for freedom. You were raised for duty." "I was raised in a lie," Edward said. A quiet ripple moved through the assembled lords. The king's expression darkened. "Tread carefully." Edward's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "I have proof. Letters, court records, testimonies from within the chapel registry. I found them in the archives under the East Wing, buried but not destroyed. My mother and father were never wed. Their engagement was declared, but never fulfilled." The words struck the court like a crack of thunder. Edward stepped forward, drawing a folded sheaf of papers from his coat. "I have no rightful claim to the throne. I never did. What I have held was an illusion, supported only by silence. I am not your heir. I am your brother. Nothing more." The king remained still. His fingers closed around the arms of his chair, knuckles pale. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant chime of the tower clock. "And this discovery," the king said at last, "you now present as freedom. I present it as truth." Annalore stood still beside him. her spine straight, her breath shallow. Her heart pounded, but she held herself as she always had, in quiet defiance of every gaze that sought to reduce her. The king's eyes shifted to her again. "And this woman," he said, "this healer, this village girl, what is she to you, now that you are no longer bound by succession?" Edward looked down at Annalore, and something softened in his face, not hesitation, certainty. "She is everything." A sharp murmur rose from the courtiers, but no one stepped forward to interrupt. "She is the one who saw me not as a prince or a pawn, but as a man worth saving. She is the one who gave without asking, who walked away when she had nothing. And she is the one I choose, not as a symbol, not as a subject, but as a partner." The king looked at his brother for a long moment. Behind him, a court scribe had begun taking notes in the corner, the scratch of his quill faint but persistent. "You would throw away your title," the king said quietly, "for love. I would throw away a lie for a life worth living." The king exhaled, the sound heavy in the still chamber. "Then go. I release you from courtly obligation. I release you from succession. You will have no income, no estates, no voice in council." "I never asked for any of it," Edward replied. "And you," the king said, turning once more to Annalore, "you will not be received at court." She inclined her head with composure. "I did not come to be received." The king stood, the fabric of his coat falling in rich folds. "Then may your life be as simple and contented as you seem to believe it will be. Go from here in peace, but do not return." Edward bowed once more, not as a subject, but as a man offering the final gesture of a chapter closed. They left the palace together. There was no procession, no fanfare. Only the soft echo of their footsteps fading down the stone corridor and the open sky waiting beyond the gates. They returned to the north, where the land rose wild and windswept, and the sea spoke in whispers along the cliffs. It was there, near the moor-bound coast, that they found a stone chapel weathered by years and salted air. It stood alone among the heather, its bell rusted but its door still sound. They were married on a morning kissed by mist. No heralds announced their vows, no nobles stood witness. Only the village priest, his robes simple and clean, stood between them as they clasped hands and spoke words that needed no embellishment. The wind swept through the grass as they stepped from the chapel into the light. There were no titles, no guards, no kingdom waiting, but there was truth, and there was choice. They settled in a whitewashed cottage on the edge of a cliff where the wind never quite ceased. Annalore reopened a small apothecary, her shelves lined with balm jars and dried leaves hung from the beams. Edward, no longer a prince, spent his days teaching village children to read beneath the great oak near the schoolhouse. His students called him Mr. Edward, and he answered without hesitation. The years passed with the quiet grace of something that no longer needed to prove itself. In the small coastal village where the wind rarely rested, Annalore and Edward built a life shaped not by duty, but by devotion. The garden grew thick with lavender, thyme, and rosemary, their stems heavy with the rhythm of the seasons. The breeze off the sea carried salt and the scent of blossoms through the open windows each evening. Annalore, now both wife and mother, moved with the calm of someone who had laid fear to rest. The village apothecary bore her name now, and her hands still healed, small wounds, old aches, and sometimes simply the weariness of the heart. People came to her not out of obligation, but because they trusted her. Edward had become the village schoolmaster. He taught beneath the great fig tree near the field, worn books open in his lap. Children gathered close around him. He spoke to them of letters and numbers, but also of stories, ones that mattered more than crowns or legacies. Stories of courage, choice, and love. Each evening, they gathered in the garden, bathed in golden light. Their child ran between the lavender bushes, his laughter rising gently above the sound of the waves. Sometimes Edward lifted him high onto his shoulders, while Annalore watched from the doorway, a linen towel in her hands, a quiet smile on her face. There was peace, There was permanence. Nothing else needed to be proven, nothing else needed to be said. The past, with its burdens and scars, had been left behind. Not forgotten, but transformed. And there, among flowers, books, and shared silences, lived a love that no title had bestowed, and no renunciation had ever taken away. They had chosen each other, and that had been everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.